Okay, continuing with core attributes of API, and we'll move on to tone in this session. Now, tone or hue is the relative brightness or colour in objects. Tend to be called tone in black and white photography, grayscale, or hue in colour photography. It's essential to discerning in conjunction with things like shape, pattern and texture, differences in things like vegetation and soils. In this image here is a clear example of a different hue or tone either side of a line. It's fairly clearly defined through this part of the imagery. You'll see that there's a darker colour in the ground surface to the southern areas of that line, paler colour to the north, grading over the side of what looks like a drainage line to back to a darker colour. So this particular area in here has a paler tone, or paler hue than the surrounding areas of, in this case, grassland. That can be through different species, it can be through shorter physical grass strands, through grazing pressure, it can be through a variety of different results of land management, say cultivation, recent cultivation of this paddock, and has it come back quickly to a decent coverage of pasture. You'll see that the roads leading through this section indicate a pale soil type, so that pale soil type might be showing through a thinner mantle of vegetation, for example. So tone is another diagnostic tool in that particular image. This is a fairly easily recognisable land use, obviously one in an urban area, and most people will be able to identify what it is, but if asked to describe why they know what it is, they might find themselves having to hunt around for suitable descriptors, and that's why we're talking about things like tone, colour, pattern, shape, texture. There's tonal variations in hue, variations in colour along these areas of fairly even texture, fine texture. I'll talk about texture in a moment. Some darker green colours in these areas, some areas of bright green, some areas of darker greeny greys, some linear features surrounding the area. There's a fairly regular pattern of this particular land use feature. There's a fairly significant building associated with it, and a fairly significant area that looks like a car park. So you can use texture, tone, colour, these sorts of things to describe this particular area, which is of course a golf course. This is a good example of the value of hue, tone, colour. You'll see that there's a gradation from this area up the hill. As you come down off the ridge, I think it's down off the ridge in this particular direction, you get into an area of darker soils. These areas have been recently cultivated. You'll see a faint greenish hue on this area over here, which is indicative of early stages of germination of a crop. See that that's absent on this particular paddock, so that this area has probably been planted to crop sometime before this one has, and this one's either been just prepared and hasn't been planted yet. These areas still have a paler toning about them, even though they look like they're fairly recently cultivated. It may be that they still retain some stubble or surface vegetative cover that's producing a fainter tone, despite the fact that the soil underneath is somewhat similar. This soil up here is a completely different colour. This looks like it's been fairly recently cultivated. I suppose these areas up here with a paler toning could indicate a drier nature of the soil, or it can indicate both the fact it's drier, less recently cultivated, has some surface clutter of pastoral vegetation on it as well. But you can clearly see a cut-off area through here where there's a boundary between the soil types, and quite often where you're getting a boundary between soil types like this, you're going to get some erosion happening, which is what's happening here and down through here in the past. So tone is very useful here in diagnosing the different soil types from up here to down here, or if there's a major depression through here, this could be a highland area going down the hill, This could be a highland area going down the hill. So without the benefits of 3D, we can't make specific comments about what's up and what's down, but we can see the demarcation between the different types of soil quite clearly based on our interpretation of tone. This is a really nice image. It's an anaglyph, and it shows clearly that double-ended teardrop or lenticular pattern that we spoke about before in the direction of cultivation. You can see where they've gone around the trees and come back onto their line again. You can see some patterns here where there's no longer a tree, but where that pattern still exists. So it can be very useful to determining when an area has been cultivated sometime in the past but is no longer being cultivated. If this was a pasture paddock, that pattern would still be showing up quite clearly, as would the ones around the existing trees. Now, I mentioned this was an anaglyph. You'll be able to see the height of the trees in this paddock. You'll also be able to see that there's an area here which has been recently cultivated, more recently than this. You'll see that the surface patterning on this area, which is probably indicative of stubble retention, and this area has been recently cultivated, so that's been turned into the soil, and so you're seeing a fresher, cleaner soil tone coming through without the surface clutter. You're seeing an area here of grassland with scattered trees and clumps on it. No evidence of any previous cultivation showing through there at the moment. This area has probably been retained under pasture and similar land cover for some extended period of time. Okay, let's move on to texture. This is can be a bit complicated at first glance, but we'll see how we go. It's a frequency of tonal change. Probably the best way to describe that is to give you some visible examples. In this particular image, you'll see here that this area here has large bulbous trees, fairly big rounded canopies. This area through here has much smaller, finer, if you would, canopies. This area over here is generally big, coarse, big rounded canopies, fairly coarse and bulbous. If you think coarse like broccoli, big lumpy heads, and fine as in fine like brushes on a clothes brush or something like that. So fine texture versus coarse texture, like a coarse broom versus a fine brush. It's probably the way to think about it. So we can describe an area which is a mix of small canopies and big bulbous ones, so it's a mix of coarse and fine texture, generally coarse, an intermediate texture, say a medium size compared to the surrounding areas, and areas of just fine, which is very fine points of vegetation canopy. Generally texture can be applied mostly to vegetation and similar things rather than to things like pastures or generally even generally fine, pale hue, pale toned areas. So in this particular instance we're using things like colour and hue as well. You can see that there's a yellowish tone through this area here, which may be flowering mottles or something similar, or it could even be early stages of leaf dieback. This area may have been poisoned with woody vegetation herbicide, for example. So smoothness or coarseness of objects that form a larger object is described in terms of texture. In this particular scene we have a coarse but even texture. We've seen this before in our avocado orchard in the last shoot. We have a generally coarse, uneven texture in this area, which is a bit difficult to see because it's in shadow. We have a fine, even texture up here with some regular disturbance, which is roads through banana plantation. And we have an ultra-fine linear texture, which we've also seen before in our vineyard and trellis planting on previous slides. As I said, it can be highly diagnostic. In this particular image we have fine conical crowns in a linear array. You see by the shadows over here, you can see coming to points. The tops of the trees are coming to points. You can see in the shadows down here that the tops of the trees are more bulbous, rounded, not coming to points particularly. Also, the trees over here have a certain very large, roughly circular canopy, whereas these are very fine. If you saw this in 3D, these would be probably shorter. You also see that there's a fine pattern in the adjoining paddock of a linear arrangement of very fine points. With experience, it becomes obvious that these areas are actually pine plantations. This is an area of native Australian eucalypt forest. You'll find that there are some bright green tones in amongst the edges of this, which are from seed dispersal from the pine area. You'll see there's some points in this area of forest here which is the same material, and this is an area of recently planted pine plantation in which the pine trees are only just starting to grow, and therefore you're seeing a higher reflectance value from the soil and surface materials, not so much the actual trees themselves. This is a very interesting slide. In this area down here you're getting an extremely fine texture, lots of fine points, as I said to you, like a brush as opposed to a broom. There are some linear features in through it, which tends to suggest that this area has been replanted mechanically in rows, and that it's all coming back at the same rate, so the whole area has been planted out at one time, so its development has taken place at a similar rate over the whole area. Quite indicative and characteristic of regrowth forest or early stage plantations. You'll find that this area up here is somewhat different. There is linear features of large bulbous crowns with coarse textures. There's a fine texture and a very mixed texture in between. There's roading up through there, and this pattern is indicative of a couple of different things, diagnostic of neither. First, it could be that this whole area has been cleared and allowed to revegetate naturally through natural seed dispersal mechanisms, and when it's been cleared, vegetation has been pushed up into long linear windrows and burnt, and that the vegetation that's now growing in those areas has benefited from the nutrient deposition, the ash bed effect, phosphorus and such, that's found in those windrows and has left ahead of the surrounding background. It could also be that these areas are left out as remaining seed sources for the intermediate areas, and so that just the areas in between have been cleaned out, and these areas have remained in place through the disturbance period. The fact that there's a large dam here may also be indicative. A large bare area, probably a log landing area. Given that these areas have been probably cleared of vegetation, there's been a necessity to have somewhere where they could be processed prior to transport, and a large significant roadway going out of the area. Okay, let's talk about shadow. Shadow can be very useful. It can suggest profiles. We've seen this before in previous tutorials, where you have a light coming from the side, in this case to this area down here, shining up through trees which are hardly visible at all in plan view, but the outline of which can be clearly seen in the shadows cast by the trees. You can see a fairly open density in the canopies of these trees as opposed to these shorter ones down here along the fence line, which are casting very dense and shorter shadows. This is an anaglyph. You may like to have a look at it in 3D. You can see that there's a texture to the actual ground surface here, a much finer pattern and fine texture on the area of cultivation to the southeast, or the bottom right. It may not necessarily be southeast. This is a useful slide. This long linear feature has been misinterpreted by some people as a roadway. It's actually not. It's an area of power, a line of power lines. You can see two individual power lines. You can see shadows being cast by the big stanchions that are holding them, or stanchions that are holding them up, regularly spaced across the landscape. You can see a roadway through here as well. Interestingly, there is a drainage depression coming up through here across to the bottom right of the image. In this area here, it is clearly shown in shadow, which gives the impression that it has some depth to it. Down here it's very vague and hard to discern, but wider. Now it may be just as deep down here as it is up here, but because it's wider it is more adequately illuminated and the shadowing isn't throwing it into sharp relief as it is over here. The same may be said of this area in here, because the light is actually coming from this direction, as you can see by the shadows of the power line stanchions. The light is shining straight up this drainage line, so you're not getting any shadowing effects. You'll also see the shadowing on the trees, give you some idea of their height. But this shadowing effect up here can be an erroneous indicator of relative depth if you're not taking into consideration the angle of light and those sorts of ancillary pieces of information. Okay, this area here, this south-facing slope, is cast into dense shadow. The vegetation in here looks much denser than it does on the northerly facing slopes. That can be quite an erroneous conclusion to draw because of the fact that the shadow complicates matters. Same can be said of these southeasterly facing slopes up here, which are cast in dense shadow as well. The northern facing slopes are quite open, the light's coming from that direction, so they're quite easy to see through the canopy to the ground surface. I think this next slide will actually describe that to you quite clearly, and it's quite a useful time series comparison. Okay, 2 spot images, spot 5 images taken 8 months apart in 2008 of exactly the same area. Try to exclude the areas which are showing some cloud and some cloud shadow. The area of interest is this ridge running through the centre of the images. You'll see in this first image that there is strong side lighting and strong shadowing on the southwestern face. In this one there is a more even illumination, so that there is an even illumination on the northeast and the southwesterly faces. This is April 2008, December 2008. So one's a summer scene, one's closer to winter. In the summer scene the sun's more directly overhead. Okay, this is the sun angle. Sun angle, well actually I should say this is not southwest, this is actually an out of, it's not orientated north up, in other words. So the light in this particular image is illuminating both sides of that ridge, and in this particular image it's coming strongly from one side. It's lower in the sky, so it's casting a dense shadow on the shadowed side of the ridge. Okay, so you would clearly say that this has got more dense vegetation if you're only looking at this, and you could be forgiven for doing that because you can't determine any real information in the shadow. Try to be aware not to make those sorts of prognostications as a guess. If you can't see it in there, you can't make those sorts of comments. In this one you can see quite clearly, because it's well illuminated, this shadowed area from the previous image. You can also see that there's a lot more information visible on the northern side. A lot more vegetation appears to be visible in this scene as opposed to the previous one. It could be a seasonal flush of growth, but it's more likely the fact that the sun angles are different than the actual change being due to on-surface growth. So same area, different sun angles, completely different perspective of what you're receiving from the feedback from the imagery. Okay. Right, let's continue. Okay, in this particular scene you can see that there's some trees here. You can see the tree trunks and branches coming up here, the foliage in this tree that's lying on the ground, and the root ball is in place. So the trees have been pushed over. You can see a big root ball there, vegetation here, trees laying on their sides, and you can see the dendritic shape, typical and diagnostic of trees that have been pushed over. There's another classic example. So shadow, we're seeing shadows of trees that are freestanding, light coming from the upper right, and yet these trees that have been pushed over are casting minimal shadows because they're laying on the ground. This area here, you can see shadows being cast to the lower left from the upper right, an area of fine texture and pale tonings over here, grading into an area where there's been some disturbance of the vegetation. You can see linear shapes lying on the ground which are consistent with, that's an important phrase, consistent with tree trunk and foliage. This is another example from the same property as the last scene, where large numbers of trees have been bulldozed over, pushed over. They haven't been rung bark in place, they're lying on the ground, they're not casting shadows. So it's an indicative pattern and texture. This is actually a counting of the root bowls of tree trunks in an area. Each one of these little green dots is a root bowl. It's been perceived via API in 3 dimensions. So if you count up all the green dots in this, not only will you go mad, but you get a fair handle on how many trees have actually been destroyed in this area. Probably more than what you would have originally thought from your first interpretation of that scene. And as you can see, here's another area where there's an even greater density of root bowls that are visible. So quite a number of trees have been destroyed on this particular property. This is actually a property that was subject to legal action with interpretation by people from the Scientific Services Division. Yes, adding up tree numbers through root bowls is great fun. Not. Okay, so we'll go back to our main page again, and we've talked about shadow. Let's talk a little bit about site and topographic location. This is also indicative of end responses to imagery. This is an area near Coffs Harbour on the north coast of New South Wales. It's only a couple of kilometres from the ocean. This creek line here is probably brackish water, and you can see there's a depression leading up through across I think it's a railway actually, back up into the more elevated land. You can see that there's a significant change in vegetation type through colour, tone, texture, those sorts of factors. From this side of the watercourse to this side of the watercourse, coarsely textured taller vegetation casting long shadows out here, finer textured paler vegetation casting minimal shadows, shorter vegetation through here, change down slope. See a similar sort of arrangement in this watercourse going up through here. Probably halophilic vegetation, salt loving, or certainly not hydrophobic vegetation. Hydrophilic vegetation is quite happy to have its feet wet in those situations. Okay, and let's finish off with association. Now, let's assume that we're looking at an area of the landscape, and as I mentioned before, we're talking about co-occurrence of features with others when we're talking about association. Just imagine that you're looking at an area on the ground that you'd recognise as a showground. Now, you'd look at a showground and you'd see patterns where you have a large, generally circular central area, mostly grassy with a distinct border around it. Most showgrounds have got like a central arena. It might have a range of differently sized buildings around the perimeter. Some could be quite tall, others very small. If you saw a large circular area with just a few outbuildings, it might be a sports oval. But a showground has pavilions and things like that, so we'd generally be able to discern between, say, a showground and a sports ground on those sorts of bases. Your showground would probably have lots of shady trees, probably fairly large canopies, casting long shadows. It would have access roads with car parking. It would have outbuildings with access roads. This isn't a showground. The points I was making then were to enable you to discern what is a showground based upon the characteristics that we all associate with things like showgrounds. You may be able to immediately glance at this and know what it is. Many people won't be able to do that, so we'll run through some of the points of association that can increase our ability to interpret what the land use is. Firstly, we've got some water supply dams. These are fairly dark and reasonably clear. There doesn't seem to be any turbid water in them. Viewed three-dimensionally, they are flat areas. They are not like a cultivated land use or something like that. They are so homogeneous in their surface condition that they're indicative of water. There are some other areas down here which also look like dams, but they are a bit different in colour. We'll talk about them in a minute. we have regularly shaped, darkly coloured areas up in here. So we have little square areas in here which are all fairly dark in colour, laid out in a fairly uniform arrangement, several areas of them. So we bear in mind that they are regularly shaped and dark in colour. We have large industrial style buildings with water supply fairly close nearby. We have an access road, a very significant access road that's quite wide. When you consider these are industrial sized buildings, and this is probably a single vehicle track. This is probably a dual lane road coming into this facility, so we can expect fairly heavy vehicles to be moving in. We have these wastewater capture dams, and the reason we're saying they're wastewater capture dams as opposed to water supply is because they have a fairly uniform texture, differing hues and colours between the three of these ones and this one over here, which indicates that there's different conditions in the water. If they were all uniform colour like these three up here, you'd expect that they'd be the water would be of similar characteristics. So the water being of markedly different characteristics in terms of tone and colour and such. And given that if you perceive this in a three-dimensional environment, it's downslope at these particular areas, when we associate all these functions together, we derive the fact that these are wastewater capture from this particular area. You should be starting to have some idea of what this land use is by now. Another factor is this large centre pivot irrigation area. You can see a long linear feature from the roadway to the central point. You can see a circular pattern of disturbance of that fairly fine textured surface. You can see patterns, non-homogeneous patterns coming through, so it could be either surface material or it could be a soil pattern. You're seeing a fairly even sort of stubbly coloured material over here, which is indicative of dried vegetation. You're seeing a greenish pattern over here and a linear sort of arrangement, which is another indication of growing vegetation. My guess is this is predominantly bare soil. It's a circular arrangement, so it's a centre pivot irrigation. When you start to think about what they would be growing here in close proximity to these industrial buildings and these regularly shaped facilities, you start to put two and two together and you come up with the fact that it's actually a feedlot. Stock are held here. It's dark because it's damp. It has a certain amount of top dressing from the animals. You have water supply. You have wastewater capture on site. You have fodder production. You have a major facility for bringing in additional fodder materials and exporting of the beasts once they've been grown to maturity. So these different functions in this particular area, the association of these different characteristics together, helps determine your interpretation of what the land use is. Here's some more associations. This is an anaglyph. My apologies if it doesn't show up particularly clearly, but you'll see that in this particular image there are water treatment type facilities. You can see a big tank here with an even tone inside it, another tank with a lid on top. You can see a major power line coming in to this facility here, pattern here which is consistent with a electricity substation. We'd all recognise these from suburban areas. We have an electricity substation. We have Karangi Dam, approximately 1 kilometre in this direction. So this is actually a water treatment plant for Coffs Harbour from Karangi Dam, which is Coffs Harbour's water supply. A major electrical facility here to provide power to the water plant, and perhaps even if there's some hydroelectricity generated from the dam, it could be integrated with this particular facility. I'm not sure if that's the case, but once again, association, large power demands, and indicative patterns in the landscape which describe particular land uses. This is an area of rural-urban fringe. It too is an anaglyph. This is actually the Pacific Highway. This is part of the suburbs of Coffs Harbour on the north coast. Large buildings down here are industrial estate, and this valley leading up here, and this one to a lesser extent, are very highly developed rural residential subdivisions. We have a more dispersed nature of housing, far more vegetation incorporated into the landscape, and fairly diagnostic patterns in that particular part of the world. Okay, so that basically sums up the major core attributes of API. You can see that the integration of all those particular attributes are very diagnostic in helping you come to an understanding of what a particular land use is, and time series analysis can help you make a fairly good assessment of what's been happening over time. Important thing is, particularly with reference to things like shadow, if you can't see what's going on in an area, you can't see what's going on in an area. There are limitations to API, don't guess. Here endeth the lesson.